My name is Jude Blanchette, and I'm the Freeman Chair in China Studies here at CSIS. I'm delighted to be co-hosting this event with my friend and colleague Ryan Hass, who's the Michael H. Armacost Chair at the Brookings Institution. For the next hour or so, we're going to be discussing the critical topic of human capital in China. It's the headwinds, the tailwinds that are affecting this really critical and often understudied topic, at least here in the foreign policy community, which will have a very significant bearing on not only the nature of US-China competition and the relationship between the two countries, but more critically, will have an important bearing on China's future growth and development. The proximate reason for today's discussion is a newly published report, jointly published by Brookings and CSIS, which you can go onto the CSIS website and find right now. The title of that is How China's Human Capital Impacts Its National Competitiveness. This report is part of a larger project that Ryan and I are co-leading to explore the ways in which human capital affects the US-China relationship. I'm going to ask Ryan in a few minutes to describe that project in more detail and also give some highlights from the report. We're also really thrilled today to be joined by two absolutely fantastic experts who can help us delve in more depth into some of the topics that Ryan is going to discuss very briefly at the top here. First, we've got Leta Hong Fincher, who's an adjunct professor at Columbia University. I think folks who are following China and China's development know Leta's work really well, starting with Leftover Women, the Resurgence of Gender Inequality in China, and most recently, Betraying Big Brother, the Feminist Awakening in China. And we're also delighted to be joined by Emily Weinstein, a research fellow at Georgetown University's Center for Security and Emerging Technology, CSET, as it's known here in Washington, D.C. CSET has really emerged, I think, as one of the most innovative and compelling think tanks for understanding China's innovation ecosystem, military-civil fusion, China's talent programs, how China is trying to develop a STEM pipeline, and Emily is at the center of much of CSET's work. Just very quickly on logistics before we dive into the discussion, viewers can go to the CSIS website, click the events page, and if you click the specific link for this event, you'll see a button that says Ask Live Questions here. You can ask questions at any moment. Those questions will be sent to me, and I'll work those in throughout the discussion. And then just quick run of show. As I mentioned, I'm going to turn it over to Ryan for just a few minutes, where we're going to discuss the top lines of the report, the broader project on human capital, and then Ryan and I are going to ask some questions of Leta and Emily for the remainder of the program. So with that, Ryan, why don't I turn it over to you?
Well, thank you, Jude. It's wonderful to be here and to be with everyone. I'm going to be deliberately brief in my opening comments because I'm really eager to get to this conversation. But the project itself is really driven by a simple thesis that in order to understand the nature and future trajectory of US-China competition, it's really important to have an awareness of the role that human capital, or the ability to develop talent, will play in that competition. And we often in Washington, we hear discussions about military issues, strategic issues, economic issues, but at its core, all these issues trace back to how well or poorly each country will be able to develop capital, human capital, in order to achieve their objectives. And this is a point that China's leaders seem to understand well. For those of us who follow China's media, we often see President Xi, Premier Li, and others talk about their national goals and ambitions for lifting up the talents of their people. So we wanted to set out through this project to build a baseline for understanding, not in a gloomy sense or an optimistic sense, but as fact-driven as possible, the nature of China's human capital landscape. What are their strengths, what are their setbacks, and how well are they going to achieve their objectives? And here's where we came out. It's clear that China has a long-term plan, and it is prioritizing national resources toward that plan for elevating the potential of their people. They're dedicating significant resources towards STEM education, higher education, training in their military. They're also channeling a lot of talent into these pipelines that are dedicated to advancing national objectives. And of course, China also has 4 times the population of the United States, so they don't necessarily need to become on par with American workers in a productivity basis in order to catch up or surpass the United States. At the same time, China faces pretty significant challenges on its horizon. And we wanted to try to be clear-eyed about those as well. Their demographic profile is going to get worse with time. By some measures, they're probably already post-peak in terms of their ability to harness a growing population to advance their economy. And as time goes by, they will have a profile that more closely resembles Japan's today. They also face real challenges with their urban-rural divide and the inequality of allocation of resources and opportunities for those who live in the cities and those who live in the countryside. This divide is exacerbated by the fact that they have a pretty restrictive hukou system or system for allowing domestic registration for people to move about the country. And because it's so hard for people to move about the country, it limits the top talent to be put in places where they can maximize their talent and achieve their potential. There also are challenges around ethnic issues, gender issues, minority issues that I think that we'll get into in our conversation today. But lastly, there is a bit of a challenge to the innovation environment that exists in China. People there can't access Google, the New York Times, or other things that are freely accessible to those around the world. And that lack of freedom of access to information just is an inhibition on development and innovation. Now, I know that many of our Chinese friends who are watching will say, yes, but America has all these problems too. And I think that's fair. And through this project called Vying for Talent, Jude and I also are going to take a deep, sharp look at where America has shortfalls and what it can do to meet those shortfalls so that America can lift up the potential of its people. And that's sort of where we're at with this project. We hope that the report, which is released today, thanks to the great work of Brianna Boland, Kevin Dong, Jude, and myself, will help to stimulate a discussion about where China's human capital profile is and how it should inform our own.
I just had a couple thoughts that I think became pretty salient as we were doing work on this and as we've looked at the broader issue of human capital. I mean, the first is, it is still, as of 2020, hard to get accurate assessments of China's aggregate national power. You see this as quite a politicized discussion here in the United States. I think those who are looking for a much more aggressive foreign policy on China tend to really, I think, highlight the significant strengths of China, which are numerous and many, and I think undeniable, but I think oftentimes fail to appreciate the really significant headwinds that China is facing. And it's often felt to me that an additional challenge for China is the current leadership is overly focused on areas of strategic competition with the United States to the exclusion of some of the more protean, banal reforms that they need to be making across a wide spectrum of China's economic structure. Research from folks like Scott Rozelle out at Stanford, I think, make it abundantly clear that the best way that Xi Jinping could be addressing the issue of national rejuvenation is less on military modernization and more thinking about comprehensive education reform, especially in China's rural areas where you're going to see the most population growth, and right now there's some pretty staggering headwinds in terms of educational attainment. You mentioned the demographic issues. This is a wave that we've seen coming for the better part of 30 years, and it's now very much cresting, and it is impacting structure of China's workforce, where you have net negative growth in workforce year on year. You've got this emerging retirement wave, which is going to put significant pressure on China's pension system, healthcare system, and its overall fiscal outlook. And so it seems to me that Xi Jinping would be better focused on a sort of build back better with Chinese characteristics right now than where a lot of his attention seems to be. They just published a speech in Chosher magazine the other day where Xi Jinping was talking about the need for tax reform. And for all the enormous power we've seen Xi Jinping accumulate, it's interesting that he hasn't shown his ability to put it on the toughest issues, which would be tax reform. It's easy to purge cadres, relatively speaking, than it is to institute a property tax. But if they're going to address a lot of these human capital issues, it's going to take significant fiscal resources, which will require a much upgraded tax system. And I think that's where really the rubber meets the road with how serious Xi Jinping is about rejuvenation. Anyway, that's my mini rant. Why don't we now get to actual experts? And so let's turn to Emily and Leta. Ryan is going to ask, I think, the first grouping of questions, and then I will take it after him.
Emily, in your view, what is the top strength and biggest weakness of Beijing's strategy for improving its national technology innovation environment?
An easy question to get us started. And thank you again, both folks at CSIS and at Brookings, for inviting me to chat. I've been following both of your work for a long time, obviously, so really have been looking forward to this. So in terms of the strengths of China's innovation system, I mean, talent is one of them, purely, again, based on just a numbers game. I would say, too, that as we've talked about, China has big, lofty goals that they lay out in 5-year plans, 10-year plans, 15-year plans. And honestly, those big plans and the ability to really think strategically, I think, is a really big piece of China's strengths, particularly in science and technology. We see them able to actually sit down 15 years, and I'm thinking specifically of the medium to long-term plan for science and technology development that came out in 2006. They were able to go through and actually sit down and have conversations about where they wanted to be by 2020. In a lot of instances, they have made very significant progress. Particularly, and I want to emphasize just the education point to start, because my colleagues at CSIS have done some amazing work on this, and I just want to profile some of that. So obviously, I'm from CSIS. We focus a lot on emerging technologies, in particular artificial intelligence. And some of my colleagues, led by one of my colleagues, Diana Galhouse, have done a lot of work looking at how China has improved its AI education system. And this is not just higher education, the PhDs, the super intelligent big thinkers, but down to the pre-K, down to K through 12. They've made significant strides in trying to implement AI education majors at universities and things like that. And I would say, for better or for worse, the education system is a big strength for China because it is so top-down, it is so centralized. And obviously in the United States, education is very much a state-by-state policy. Even, I'm from Georgetown University. We're a private institution. Those are more rare, I would say, in the context of China. So China has really been able to kind of blunt force push their universities into the 21st century. And just, one of our colleagues, Jack Corrigan, just published a report recently looking at how Chinese universities have really moved over the past 15 years into the top world rankings. They're not at the point of competing with some of our big universities in the United States, but they're getting very close, and I think that progress should be, we in the United States and others, if we're trying to compete effectively with China, need to pay attention to that.
Yeah. You talked about quantity having a quality all of its own. But there also is a quality standpoint. And one of the things that the Chinese leadership is focused on is attracting top talent from overseas to come to China to work and live. What is your assessment of how well that's going, and what are their opportunities for continued growth or their challenges that they'll have to overcome to get there?
So on the talent front, obviously this has been a huge part of Chinese government strategy, even way back before Xi Jinping. I would say as soon as it got to 1978, we got to Gaigo Kaifang. Everyone kind of went out, everyone was encouraged to go out and find opportunities elsewhere, and the Chinese government kind of turned around and said, oh wait, no one's coming back. So we saw the kind of emergence of these Chinese talent programs as we know now, things like 1,000 Talents, Changjiang Scholars, other things like that, that started to come out around the late 90s and into the early 2000s. And the Chinese were really strategic about thinking strategic in thinking about how they wanted to implement these talent programs. So we saw an emphasis both on not just attracting talent writ large, but looking at they really distinguished between overseas versus foreign. So Waiguo versus Haiwai. And so obviously one being the I would say the Chinese diaspora, or people that the Chinese government view to be part of the diaspora. So there's that piece of it, and then there's the overseas piece. So that's going to be the foreign experts, regardless of ethnicity or nationality or ties to China. And we've seen kind of a different type of strategy applied to both of these groups. The Chinese government has poured massive amounts of money into getting folks to want to come to the universities, and this fits kind of hand in hand with their policies to improve education. Because obviously, if you want very prominent researchers to come to your universities, you have to have a relatively high-ranking university. But on the other hand, too, when you're having these very prominent figures in your field or in their fields come to Chinese universities, it also helps to, I would say, attract talent to those universities just in general. If you're a Chinese graduate in a STEM field and computer science, and you see a very famous computer scientist from Germany come into a Chinese university, you may be more interested in going to that Chinese university to get a PhD versus going overseas. So there's kind of a twofold piece to that talent program thing. But obviously, as everyone in Washington and beyond is familiar with, a lot of these talent programs have got a lot of scrutiny in the United States and are starting to get more scrutiny elsewhere now as well. Partly for very legitimate reasons. There are kind of strange, and one of our CSEC colleagues, Bill Hannes, who is a longtime veteran in the China policy studies community, has kind of bucketed China's China's technology transfer activities into kind of three buckets, that being legal activities, illegal, and extra legal. And talent programs really fit in that extra legal bucket, where you're seeing, again, if you're a U.S. professor working in biotech and you want to sign on to a talent program with Tsinghua University, it's not illegal. But one of the issues is that these talent programs kind of push you to do things that your home university or your home country might not necessarily be comfortable with. And we've seen, with the now defunct China initiatives, what some of these talent programs have pushed people to do, including not listing that you are participating in that talent program on your resume, or trying to kind of obfuscate more of that information. And so obviously the Chinese government, I think, is going to have to, or has been also working to kind of shift its talent strategy since about 2018, when US government really started to wake up to these talent programs. A lot of it has just involved changing names of programs for ease. We saw the 1,000 Talents program go under, and is now called the National High-End Foreign Expert Recruitment Program, and brought together a bunch of other ones. So I think we'll continue to see more things like that. I think Beijing has not officially given up on the talent program strategy yet. But we may also see, and then I'll wrap this up here, we've also seen talent programs proliferating into things that are not necessarily what you would think of as a talent program. For instance, things like competitions, which are really big, particularly in emerging technologies like cybersecurity, things like that, these types of hacking contests, things like that. Those, at least in the eyes of Beijing, are considered talent programs. And for better or for worse, too, the Chinese government has on lists referred to the U.S.-China Fulbright program as a talent program. I would not categorize it as that, but on their documents, they do refer to it as that. So things are changing and shifting, but China is still in need of overseas talent. They are still not, I would say, in the clear from some type of brain drain. But unfortunately, I think a lot of the rhetoric that we've been seeing in the United States over the past 4 or 5 years is also pushing talent away from the United States and back towards China. So I think that's working in China's favor.
Yeah, I've also noticed that the numbers of enrollees in Canada have risen, which is a reminder that Chinese students have other options than the United States as well. Can I ask you about China's domestic innovation environment? And to what extent are external factors, both U.S.-China rising competition, but also further afield, to what extent are they impacting China's ability to foster the type of domestic innovation environment that they seek?
So self-sufficiency has been a key strategy of the Chinese government going back to the Mao era. I mean, it's reflective. I feel like every one of the countries in East Asia, if you've studied East Asian history, South Korea went through its own kind of self-sufficiency phase. Japan has gone through similar things. So China, again, this is not new or unique to China. But I would almost argue that tensions between the U.S. and China have pushed China to double down on a lot of this. I mean, we saw Made in China 2025 come out in 2015, along with the Innovation-Driven Development Strategy, both of which really emphasize, obviously, innovation-driven development is a way to achieve self-sufficiency. And obviously, again, Made in China 2025 is its key industrial policy that's built off of, indigenous capabilities. So I don't think it would be correct to say that the U.S. has pushed China all the way into, like, China wanted to work together with everyone to indigenize and innovate, to innovate, and then we pushed them towards that. I think they were already on that track, and we've pushed them closer. Although the Chinese, I will say, are very straightforward with their strengths and weaknesses, and all of us who have looked at Chinese government documents and Xinhua and People's Daily know that the Chinese, they talk about these things pretty openly, obviously in Chinese, so sometimes it's harder to find. But I'll give a quick plug to another CSAT report that's coming out soon that actually looks at what China believes are their choke points in technologies. And this is everything from like your very cutting edge EUV photolithography machines, obviously attached to ASML and the semiconductor supply chain in the Netherlands, but also to things as basic as aviation grade steel, where the Chinese are tracking, okay, we want to achieve indigenous innovation, we want to achieve self-sufficiency. These are exactly what we need. These are the countries that have them. They talk about ASML, they talk about in certain types of technologies, there's a Japanese company or there's a researcher in the UK that is leading at the cutting edge of this, and we need to, we have X company in China that is working there but is not there yet. So they're very forthright with a lot of this information. So I think the job now for folks like myself and others around the table is just to pay attention and really try to contextualize a lot of this stuff.
And in that final point, paying attention, are there any issues around China's domestic innovation environment that you think are being underappreciated or not fully recognized?
Very much so. I think one of them, and our director, Dewey Murdoch, testified last week for the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, and he brought up this idea that there are things in the Chinese system that we can learn from in the United States. I feel like there is such an adverse reaction when you tell a policymaker now that, our quote-unquote adversary or competitor country is doing something that we should try to do, or some people double down on the communist side and say, we're a capitalist democracy, we shouldn't be doing anything like that. But just one example of something that we could potentially learn from China. So there's some CSAT research that looked at China's open source intelligence and intelligence collection, intelligence strategy. And one of the things that was found was that they have about 60,000 personnel that are tasked with studying science and technology gains, achievements, advancements globally and reporting back on that. We have nothing like that. I've even talked to folks who have worked in the intelligence community here in the US for decades. Nothing like that. So, that's one thing where if we want to effectively compete with China, and not just China, we should be competing with everyone from, China and Russia to even, some of our allies. We should be competing with Europe. We should be competing with Southeast Asia. So learning things like that, I think taking a second, stepping back and saying, okay, what is China doing well in innovation that, we can potentially emulate, I think is a valuable thing to do.
And are there any specific sectors that you think that merit further study of what they're doing well that we could learn lessons from?
I would say, at least in artificial intelligence, I'll harken back to some of their AI education initiatives. I think there's a lot that can be done at the state level in the United States to look at improving tech literacy at the K through 12 level. And again, my colleagues are doing some great work on that. I do think as well, I get the question a lot about in biotechnology, is there anything that, is it worth collaborating with China because of, biometric data being collected, the issues with minorities in Xinjiang and others. I would say I would be scared if all biomedical, biotechnology researchers between the US and China stopped talking. Mm-hmm. I do think in terms of advancing medicine globally, I do think we need to keep paying attention to what the Chinese are doing and having those conversations with them. Because if the Chinese are coming up with the cure to cancer, I don't think we want to stop talking to them just because it's China who finds the cure. So I would say keeping in mind what the Chinese are doing that is not great, but also, again, not letting that be the reason we turn away.
Thank you, Emily.
Leta, what if we could shift gears to talk about some of the ways in which China and the leadership is conceptualizing some of the demographic challenges and then some of the solutions that they're putting forward. Before I ask some of those questions, I actually wanted to ask you a broader question, though, which is the Communist Party of China is a male-dominated political institution. The further up you go, the power ladder, the more male-dominated it becomes. You've done a lot of, I think, great writing on how this shapes the solutions that they're finding. Can you talk to us a little bit about the connection between how that gender composition of senior leadership and decision-making in China affects how they think about the sorts of solutions that they're going to find?
Sure. Well, I'd also like to thank CSIS and Brookings for inviting me here. So I've written a lot about how China's authoritarian system is very patriarchal. It's a patriarchal authoritarianism that really, I argue, relies on the systematic subjugation of women. And so for a long time, we've certainly believed that, you know, the Communist Party put economic growth above practically everything else, certainly in the era of market reforms. But under Xi Jinping in particular, it's becoming more and more clear that, you know, so-called politics is in command rather than economics. And we're seeing a lot of that right now with the zero COVID policy, where they've completely locked down Shanghai. I just heard that Beijing University had this big protest happening, I believe, even right now or yesterday. So there are a lot of things that are completely unpredictable, I believe, and it's stability above all else. That goes for all gender issues. So the Communist Party in the past, of course, has really believed in gender equality. It's enshrined in the Constitution. But I've written a lot about how in the reform era, gender inequality has really surged in many, many ways. It continues to rise. So you would think that, you know, with economic growth slowing, that one of the things that the party would want to do is to enable more talented women to work. But it's doing the complete opposite. You look at the labor force participation rates for women continues to decline. It's really plummeted over the last couple of decades. And the gender gap in labor force participation rates is growing instead of decreasing, which is what is happening in most other major economies in the world. The gender income gap is increasing. I mean, there are blatant forms of gender discrimination in hiring and in the university entrance exam, Gaokao, which really blatantly discriminates against women who are required to score higher than men who are applying for slots to a lot of different university programs. And then, of course, politically, there's never been a woman on the standing committee. There's currently only one woman on the Politburo, and the percentage of women at the Central Committee level has actually fallen and is dismally low. And I've thought about this for a very long time, and I've basically come to the conclusion that China's leaders, particularly Xi Jinping, believes that Communist Party survival actually depends on keeping women down, on pushing women back to very traditional roles of wife and mother in the home. You see that a lot in the rhetoric from Xi Jinping's own speeches. You see that as well with population planning policies. I mean, maybe we could talk about that a little bit more. But this is one of the areas where it does not make any economic sense whatsoever. So clearly this is a political decision. It's that the leaders have decided, the male leaders, that it is essential for political stability in China that women all return to the home and be docile wives and mothers.
Can we pull on that thread a little bit more? Because I think that's such an important point, and I'm not studying this nearly as close as you, but it does feel to me that there's quite a cultural conservatism that's really coming to the fore. And I wonder if I could get your thoughts on the following. Now that Beijing is seeing some of these demographic reports come in, especially they've gotten census numbers the last 2 years have been pretty, from a national planning perspective, have been pretty dismal. How is that going to change how they're thinking about family planning policies and how they think about the role of women?
Right. Well, if you look at I call them population planning because family planning is a little too benign for what is happening in China. So population planning has always been very coercive and draconian in China. Now, after decades of the so-called one-child policy, they've completely reversed course. Starting in 2016, they implemented a two-child policy, which was supposedly projected to, lead to a bump in births, which there was a tiny little bump at the beginning, but we've seen a decline in births, in the number of newborns, for 5 consecutive years. And this is extremely alarming to the Communist Party leadership. And so last year, in the summer, they came out with a 3-child policy. And along with that is corresponding propaganda saying, oh, it's really glorious, patriotic to have more children. But that's not happening. I mean, people, particularly women in their 20s and 30s, don't want to have children. A lot of them don't want even 1 child, let alone 2, or certainly not 3. Men as well, a lot of young men also don't even want children. So what I've begun to notice is, I had long expected that we might end up seeing abortion restrictions in China. I think this is incredibly politically sensitive, given the long history of forcing women to be sterilized or force mass insertion of IUDs. And so the government can't just announce outright overnight that they're going to have an abortion ban. But I believe that we are seeing more and more, we're certainly seeing more and more language referring to the need to reduce what they call medically unnecessary abortions. That's extremely controversial. A lot of young women in particular are extremely angry about that. But we've already seen reports of how it's much more difficult for men to get vasectomies. So we're going to see a lot more of this kind of pro-natalist approach by the government, and it's extremely unpopular.
Can I ask a question then, building off of your most recent book, looking at sort of a feminist awakening and the growth of a feminist awakening recently in China? How do you see this pronatalism coming from the Communist Party colliding with aspirations that many young Chinese women have to be fully participating in the workforce and have the careers that many of their male peers have? Do you have any prognosis that we will see more collisions and sparks along this front? Is this auguring a new era of much more repressive, coercive actions by the Communist Party to forestall any such sort of feminist agitation along these lines?
Yes. We've already seen enormous crackdowns on feminist activism in China. I've written a lot about that in my last book, Betraying Big Brother. That crackdown on feminist organizing continues. It's really amazing to me that in spite of these incredibly rigid crackdowns, that there are still always emerging these grassroots feminist responses, new forms of political activism. There's also their own version of the Me Too movement, where individual women, largely women, come out and they're determined to tell their stories about sexual assault. As an example is the tennis champion Peng Shuai, who came out and wrote about being sexually assaulted by Zhang Gaoli, the former vice premier. And then, we still don't know what's going on with her. She's very likely under house arrest. And they trotted her out briefly during the Olympics to claim that everything was okay. But I'm sure that these kinds of clashes are going to continue, that there is a very strong diaspora of Chinese feminists So even as the crackdown intensifies inside China, there's continual, and I would say growing activism outside China that is very different from the human rights activism that we saw in the past, because there's a rather large feminist community, and so they continue to communicate with each other. That's going to be, that kind of confrontation from top and below is going to continue for the foreseeable future, I would think.
I want to now just intersperse some of the questions. We've got about 20 minutes left. I think this is a question for everyone at the table that was sent in. Is there any possibility that China is going to see a real exodus of talent as its political system continues to close? There's been a lot of reporting now about what's going on in Russia, where you're seeing this wave of young, talented individuals leave the country as they look at the prospects for development there. I think pulling together some of the threads, Leta, that you were just talking about in terms of the prospects that many young Chinese women face or are looking towards, we've seen this unrelated, but we've seen this crackdown on the platform economy, which may or may not be relaxing a little bit now, but nonetheless, a lot of the expectations that many Chinese entrepreneurs could have of sort of unfettered growth opportunities, Silicon Valley on steroids, is now changing. So I guess to put it to all three of you, will this get to a point where China now starts to force out many of the talented who are looking for opportunities overseas? I actually just remembered The Economist last week had a piece on searches on Baidu for a coded word for basically getting out of Dodge was increasing. So are any of you seeing or see that as a possibility projecting out after the 20th Party Congress, Xi Jinping takes his third of who knows how many terms? How might that affect the talent environment? Emily, I'll start.
I can start.
With you.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think it's a really big concern right now, and I think part of what we're seeing at this point in time is China trying to play both sides. There's a lot of rhetoric now about this big tech crackdown maybe ending, and I wouldn't say it's ending. That's kind of the messaging that's coming out of China. We're trying to soften things. We're trying to make it easier. But entrepreneurship in China is such a weird concept, because entrepreneurship and innovation inherently assumes ability to take risks. And China is not the type of system that is very welcoming to risk. And I mean, when you're talking too about, Silicon Valley versus innovation in China, there's still a lot, or the majority of innovation in China where, in Silicon Valley where we saw it come out a little bit more organically, the majority of it in China is still very much blunt force from the government. Even if you're looking at, venture capital. Most of the venture capital companies in China have some amount of government backing, government stakeholders. At this point, too, a lot of the venture capital is coming from companies like Alibaba, Baidu, and Tencent. Like they are being asked or told by the Chinese government to help and go and foster the next Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent. So in that sense, I think we're going to see, as the government starts to realize that they're losing people, and I'll come back to that point in a second. As they realize that they're losing people, there might be more of this opportunity where they try to compromise on things like, you are, a very innovative startup in biotechnology. We really need you. Let's kind of paint you up as this big, fancy, almost like, the example I'm thinking of is, if anyone's familiar with Liu Ruopeng, the founder of Quangchi, which is a metamaterials company out in Shenzhen. They pretty much called him the Elon Musk of China. And this was back probably 5-10 years ago. And he has become kind of like I wouldn't say he's a Jack Ma. He's much more of a, hey, look, I was educated abroad. I came back and look at me contributing to innovation in China. And actually, fun fact about that is Xi Jinping, when he first came to power in 2012, Quangchi was actually the first company he ever visited. So I think we might see some of the resurgence of this type of activity of talking about the patriotism attached to staying in China and doing that piece. But I think on the flip side, just talking about the opportunities for Chinese students and scholars to go abroad, right now the rhetoric around the world, particularly in the United States, but I would say also elsewhere, we had just an incident in California this past weekend that was targeted at the Taiwanese community out there. The rhetoric is not one that is welcoming to Chinese students and scholars or just citizens in general. This is obviously, again, not specific to Chinese people of Chinese descent. And I think if the United States really wants to be a place where if folks in China or in Russia or in other countries are not comfortable where they currently live, if we want to become a place that people want to go to, I think we have a lot we need to do. And it's kind of, I almost laugh, every year, as you all know, Global Times or one of these Chinese institutions publishes a report on the human rights violations in the United States, and it's kind of like the worst person just made the best argument. We see a lot of that, and China loves to play up this, the United States is racist, the United States is dangerous, the gun violence, and it's true. So if we want to start being a place where talented folks want to come if they can't move forward in China, I think there's a piece of it that is starting at home while simultaneously encouraging folks to come. It's a long-winded answer, but I hope that was helpful.
Leta, any thoughts on that? If we were to tease out this pronatalism becomes even more coercive and aggressive, do you foresee that incentivizing or pushing some of China's talent to begin looking elsewhere?
Oh, certainly, yes. Especially, and it's not just the pronatalism, I think it's, everything, the zero COVID policies. Everything is becoming so incredibly repressive in China. And I completely agree with Emily that, of course, the U.S. government should absolutely, welcome more, people of around the world. And I believe that the U.S. is, starting to invite more of these highly qualified Russians or educated Russians, or loosening visa requirements for them. And I actually think we should be doing the same thing for people coming from China. But really, we should be welcoming refugees from around the world. Certainly, because they're going to enhance America as a whole in many different ways. But I think it's not going to be, the Chinese government is going to make it perhaps a lot more difficult to leave as well. So I think that certainly we're going to continue to see people wanting to leave, young people wanting to leave China for other countries, if not the U.S.
Another question coming in asking for how the U.S. and China might find some sort of accord on how they think about talent programs. One of the things that strikes me is when we conceptualize about talent programs, especially China's, obviously CSIS has done a lot of good work highlighting some of the very problematic components of talent programs, but I'm not sure we always recognize in the United States that one of the reasons or prime motivations for China's talent programs is they're trying to make sure talent is coming back because they've seen a net exodus, or they felt like they're seeing an exodus of talent. Do you see this? Do you see this as being a perpetual point of friction in the bilateral relationship, or is there some prospect of maturation on both sides to where there's a normalization of the rules of the road on talent programs? Any thoughts on that?
I would love to see us come to a consensus. I am skeptical that we can. I think for the United States, this potential of like a stagnation in talent flows and other, the news about people going to Canada, people going to Australia, people going to the UK and elsewhere instead of the United States should be a bit of a wake-up call. But the U.S. for decades has been the place that everyone went, or that everyone came to. So the U.S. has never really had to think about anything like a talent program before. I think the area where we're going to continue to disagree with China is going to be on to use a Chinese jargony term, on the win-win side of talent programs. Because a lot of the core essence of Chinese talent programs is that it is a win for China, and there's not usually that much that benefits the US side. So for instance, if you are a US professor working in, X type of STEM technology, you become part of 1,000 Talents. Usually you're going to go over to China, set up some type of company. You're going to have a professorship at a Chinese university that sponsors you for that talent program. And you're going to be doing a lot for the Chinese side. Usually, without the US side knowing, or if the US side knows, there's not really much else that they're getting, at least based on the contractual sides of the talent programs. I think there are parts of talent collaboration between the US and China, just a professor emailing one professor in another country, that would be nearly impossible to regulate, and I would advise against it, because we need international collaboration. There's so much literature out there that talks about the importance of international collaboration for innovation in science and technology. But one of the things that I'd point out too, and I'm going to again throw out some CSIS research from former senior fellow Melissa Flagg and one of our data scientists, Autumn Toney, that actually looked at patterns of co-publications between different countries. This included the US, this included China and others. And we actually saw that China is the least collaborative in terms of science and technology co-publications around the world. And the top 4 in this study, and this was as of 2019, the UK, Australia, Canada, and the US were the most collaborative in terms of co-publications. Only 10% of Chinese publications in 2019 were co-published with an international collaborator. So that to me is why, again, I remain a little bit skeptical about China's willingness to collaborate for the greater good. But I would say, just to wrap up quickly on a point that we can learn from China, I think, and this is going to go back to what I was just saying, to what Leta was just saying, about making it easier for folks to come to the United States. I think there's a lot to be done on visa policy in the US. There are so many countries right now. I know South Korea has some equivalent of a STEM talent visa. There are other countries that are thinking about this type of program. And I know the US, the Biden administration, has done things to work on OPT and other things to help international students find jobs here. But right now the US has no visa for, let's say you're a wonderful PhD student in nanotechnology and you want to start your own firm. You can't do that. There's no one who's going to sponsor your visa for you to start your own company. I think that's a huge gap. And that, I don't want to say it's like the US version of a talent program, but I think there are things that we can think about, getting rid of, everyone jokes, industrial policy was a taboo. I think we're moving away from that. Let's move away from talent programs being so taboo and think about them in terms of how they could actually benefit us.
Can I put you on the spot and ask, immigration reform as talent program, what are your thoughts on where the United States is maybe failing to take advantage of some of the dynamics domestically in China, which are opening up a potential valve of talent looking for other opportunities?
I agree completely with Emily. I think that one of America's asymmetric advantages has been its ability to attract top talent from around the world to want to come, live, and work here and contribute to American society. And we're underutilizing that asymmetric advantage right now. I think that as the situation grows more repressive in China, and Leta provides a very compelling narrative arc for the trajectory that China finds itself on, there are going to be highly talented individuals that want a place to be able to flourish and for their children to grow up in an environment where they can reach their potential as well. And it's absolutely incumbent upon us as a country, if we really genuinely care about competing with China or competing with others around the world, this is how we do it. This is what it takes. And if we're serious about it, then we need to find a way to get over the hurdles that we're putting in front of ourselves by limiting the ability of talented people from around the world to want to be able to come here.
And if I could just add quickly too, I think one of the arguments I've had against me that I've had when I've brought up the same kind of conversation is, well, what happens if the Chinese government steps in and wants to coerce people who are, here in the United States, want to be here, want to contribute, but the Chinese government maybe is threatening their family, or there are some other coercive things happening behind the scenes. I think one of the things that the U.S. government can do, particularly in the academic realm, is foster a better environment for coming to, whether this be like a university administrator, whether this be someone in the FBI, someone at DHS, anyone who you can come to and say, look, this has happened to me, I want help, or I want I need help. Because I think particularly with talent programs, a lot of people, particularly of Chinese ethnicity, were here, wanted to be here, saw a great opportunity to collaborate with colleagues in China, didn't realize totally what they got into, and then found themselves stuck. And if they went to a university administrator or went to the FBI, they would get arrested. And I think this is so problematic for a whole host of reasons. And I think if we want to really work on, not only getting people to come here, giving them the visas, but really protecting them from, as people say, the long arm of the Chinese Communist Party, I think we need to stop viewing these people with so much suspicion always. I think we need to, again, we're innocent until proven guilty. And I think we need to stop associating people of Chinese ethnicity with first loyalty to their home country.
I think it's entirely un-American to assume that someone, because of their ethnicity, is disloyal to the United States.
Yes.
Leta, I've got a multi-part question that's directed to you. I'm going to take two of the sort of 8 questions that were just sent to me, just to make it easier on you. One is asking about the extent of females in positions in sort of the Chinese corporate China. So are we seeing a mirrored picture of what we see in terms of a male-dominated political system when we turn to the private sector? The person mentioned, we know the pony ma's, the jack ma's. So is there a mirror there within the corporate system? And then I'll save my second question after this one.
Sure. I mean, there are a lot of people who argue that, in fact, there are women who are CEOs in China. This is not something I follow that carefully, so I can't name them. Some people argue that, well, you have more prominent senior executives who are women in China than even in the US. So certainly there are fewer barriers for advancement of women in the corporate sector in China than in the government sector, but that's really not saying very much. Moreover, the very senior female executives in China, they got there in spite of massive gender discrimination, and they never criticize the government publicly. They never talk very concretely about the barriers that they themselves have encountered because they realize that their situation is very precarious. So it's still very bad for women in the private sector as well as in government.
The second question was about the longer-term implications or legacy of Peng Shuai's accusation. The question is that after the Olympics occurred, where there was a lot of media attention on the issue of Peng Shuai, it seems to have faded. So is that now essentially over, or are there longer-term implications from her accusations that have either galvanized domestically in China, or we're just not seeing?
Yeah, well, I mean, there certainly isn't any media coverage of her because nobody knows what's going on with her. It's really difficult to report on something when you have no transparency whatsoever. I mean, during the Olympics, the Chinese government, hand in hand with the International Olympic Committee, were deliberately putting her out before cameras to show that, that she was supposedly fine. I believe that as long as she continues to be effectively under house arrest, which she probably is, and that's likely to be the case for a very, very long time, that issue of her lack of freedom is going to kind of simmer, and it's going to make people angry. It certainly makes Chinese feminist activists angry. That's not something that they have forgotten, even though there isn't any news coverage of her in particular. Moreover, I think that this feminist movement, I mean, it comes to me, I think it's really extraordinary that given the amount of repression, persecution of feminist activists in China, that you continue to see with regularity. Every few months, there's always something that comes up that gets news coverage, actually. You know, some case of a rape victim who wants to tell her story, or, you know, the something that the case of the so-called chained woman in rural China who was trafficked and forced to give birth. I mean, that sparked an enormous amount of outrage across China, actually, on social media, even though it was very heavily censored. And so I don't think that the case of Peng Shuai will ever be completely over. I mean, that's going to just add to the long list of grievances that a lot of young women and feminists continue to have in China.
We're almost perfectly at time. We have 2 minutes left. So what I might just do is do a round robin of anything that you didn't get to say earlier that you wanted to say, or something that Ryan and I said that you viscerally and vehemently disagree with. So why don't I go Emily, Leta, and then Ryan, I'll give you the benediction, and then we can get everyone out of here right on time. Anything we missed, or any sort of broad parting thoughts on this issue of human capital, innovation, and China's future rise and development?
Yeah, I would just say one of the big things that I advocate for, and a lot of the work I do focuses on academic collaboration or S&T collaboration at the research level. And I think one of the things I'm hoping to see is the U.S. moving from this very risk-averse policy, and I say policy very, very loosely, in collaborating with China, to really more of something that looks at a cost-benefit analysis. Let's see, you know, obviously there might be costs to doing, to collaborating with certain Chinese scientists from certain institutions or who are working in certain fields, but let's also then take a step back and say, you know, what can the U.S. gain from this? Because I think there are certain areas where China is leading in science and technology, and it behooves us to collaborate with those researchers with the risks in mind, but knowing that we do have something to gain from them as well.
Great, thank you. Leta, any final thoughts?
Yes, so I mean, we did talk about pronatalism in China. I think is very important. The flip side to the pronatalism is what is happening with ethnic Uyghurs and Kazakhs, where it's the complete opposite. This has to do with the Chinese government believing that, you know, they want to upgrade the overall population quality, and in their view, that means get Han Chinese women to have more babies and get women who are seen as quote-unquote low-quality, problematic women like Uyghurs and Kazakhs to have fewer babies, and they're using very horrifying methods like mass forced sterilization, forced insertion of IUDs, and we've even heard of some forced abortions among these women. And so that's you know, the other side of the same coin, and trying to engineer a particular kind of quote-unquote high-quality population.
Yeah, important point. Ryan.
Well, I think this has been a really rich conversation that has helped us move from sort of a monochromatic understanding of China as China to the multivariate aspects of China. And what I've taken away from the conversation is that China has abundant strengths. It also has real weaknesses in its human capital profile. And it also has vulnerabilities that the leadership appears to be reacting to. And in the process of doing so, they may be creating problems for themselves in the future.
Well, we're right at time, and so let me thank all of you. Thank you for coming across town. Thank you for coming down from New York. Thanks to Ryan and Kevin over at Brookings. Thanks to Brianna here at CSIS, and thank you to colleagues behind the camera here at CSIS who make all of this happen. Ryan and I will be putting out, along with our colleagues, further research events and podcasts trying to probe these important issues over the next months. So would hope that people will continue to visit the CSIS and Brookings website and subscribe to the Vying for Talent podcast, which Ryan and I are putting together along with our colleagues. So thank you, everyone. Have a great Monday. And for those of you here in DC, hopefully we survived the storm that is roiling overhead right now. So thank you very much.